Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going deep on enterprise risk management.
ERM.
Yeah, ERM. And I know that might sound a little, dry.
Maybe a little bit boardroomy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But honestly, stick with us on this one because seeing how big organizations think about uncertainty and how they try to protect what they've built, it's actually a really cool way to understand how decisions get made, and maybe even some takeaways you can use in your own life.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. Like, how do the people making the big calls, how do they try to avoid those potholes in the road?
Yeah.
And I don't just mean bad stuff. I mean opportunities too, right?
Right.
So we're going to try to do that today, give you that shortcut to understanding, like I said, how they think. And we're going to pull out the main ideas from our sources today without getting too lost in the weeds.
Yeah.
And hopefully you walk away with a really solid understanding of what ERM is and why it's important.
Totally. And, we've got some really great material to work with today.
Yeah.
We're looking at excerpts from ERM Chapter 2, Principles of Risk Management.
Okay.
By Pritesh Bithwas. And what's really cool about this is it pulls from a bunch of globally recognized standards like ISO 31000, CASO, and the Orange Book.
I've heard of a few of those.
So it's not just one person's take. It's like these are established frameworks that people use worldwide.
Okay, yeah, these are the real deal.
Yeah.
Not just someone's opinion.
Yeah.
This is what people actually use.
Exactly. So where does all this begin? Well, it comes down to the idea of adding value, right? You want the best possible outcomes, but you want to minimize the chances of something bad happening.
Right. You want to control what you can control.
Exactly. So ISO 31000, it talks about this idea of value creation and protection. And that's where we're going to start today with the principles that really underpin ERM. What are those kind of core ideas?
Yeah, it's interesting because when you start comparing these frameworks, like you said, the ISO 31000, the COSO, and the Orange Book, they each have their own way of talking about the principles.
Right.
But there are some, consistent themes you start to pick up on, right? So, for example, ISO 31000, that outlines 8 principles.
Okay.
And they emphasize things like tailoring your approach, getting everyone involved, making risk management part of everything you do.
Right.
And always trying to make things better, constant improvement. COSO 2017, that one's a bit more structured.
Yeah.
5 interconnected components and 20, count them, 20 underlying principles.
Okay.
Covering everything from your organization's culture, governance, how you communicate, the whole shebang. And then there's the Orange Book. Now, this one's kind of interesting, right? It's specifically designed for government bodies in the UK.
Okay.
And it's got 5 main principles. Really focuses on strong governance. Making risk management, again, part of everything the organization does, really encouraging people to work together, establishing those clear processes, and again, always looking for ways to improve.
I feel like I'm already getting lost in all these frameworks and principles. How can our listeners, I guess, make it a little easier to, keep track?
So the author actually gives us this really handy acronym.
Okay, I love a good acronym.
Right. And this one is PACED. PACED.
PACED. Okay, got it.
So first up, we have proportionate.
Proportionate.
Now, what this means is one size does not fit all when it comes to ERM.
Of course, that makes sense.
Right. Think about it. A tiny startup, they're not going to manage risk the same way as like a huge multinational company, right? It needs to be tailored. It needs to fit the size, the industry, the specific goals, and the challenges of each organization. But, and this is important, the author also points out that consistency in language around risk is super important. So even though you're tailoring it, everyone needs to be speaking the same language.
Yeah, so you're not talking past each other.
Exactly. If different teams are using totally different terms for the same risks, it's going to be really tough to get that big picture of what's happening.
That overview.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, so proportionate, what's next in PACED?
All right, next we've got aligned.
Okay.
So what this means is ERM can't just be this thing off on its own.
Right, like in a silo.
Exactly. It needs to be connected to everything else that's going on in the organization.
Right.
Strategic planning, everyday operations.
So like woven into everything else.
Yeah, think of it like weaving a thread of risk awareness through everything they do.
Okay.
And that way everything runs smoothly, and most importantly, they get that good information for reporting.
Yeah, I guess if it's not part of the day-to-day, then you're not really going to be able to use the information that you get from it.
Exactly. And if we zoom out a bit, alignment means that risk management isn't seen as just another bureaucratic hurdle to jump over. Right.
It's a crucial part of reaching those big goals the organization has set.
Okay.
And it helps to make risk awareness part of everyday decision making at every level.
Okay, I like that. So proportionate, aligned, what's the C?
Comprehensive.
Okay.
So good ERM, it doesn't just look at what's going on inside the organization.
Right, right.
It also takes into account that bigger picture, that external environment.
So like what the economy is doing.
Yeah, the economy, technology changes, the regulatory landscape, even what your competitors are doing.
Right.
It's about getting that 360-degree view to find both the risks you already know about and those that might be popping up on the horizon.
Yeah, and those are the ones that can really sneak up on you.
Yeah, and in today's world, everything is so connected.
Yeah.
You know, organizations are being influenced by all these external things, so it's crucial to have that comprehensive view.
So you don't miss anything.
Exactly.
Okay, we're on to E now.
Embedded. That's a good one.
Embedded, okay.
This is all about making risk awareness part of the organization's DNA,
Okay,
like their culture, their values, the way people act.
okay.
So you're creating an environment where everyone knows that managing risk is important, and thinking about the downsides, it becomes second nature.
Got it.
And that leads to more mature and effective risk management.
Yeah, it's not something you have to force on people.
Right.
It's just how they do things.
Exactly. And this one, embedding it in the culture. A lot of people say it's one of the toughest parts,
Really?
but it's also the one that makes the biggest difference.
Interesting.
Yeah, when everyone understands their role in spotting and managing risks, it becomes much more proactive.
Yeah, not waiting for something bad to happen.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got proportionate, aligned, comprehensive, embedded that leaves D.
Dynamic. And this is all about recognizing that ERM is not a static thing.
Yeah.
It's not a document you create once and then forget about.
Right. All right.
It's an active, ongoing process. That goes way beyond just having that risk register. It's about using the information you gather through risk management to make decisions, to adapt to change,
Okay.
and to keep adding value to the organization.
So constantly adjusting.
Yeah, think of it like this. That risk register, it's just a snapshot.
Okay.
A dynamic process means you're constantly reviewing, updating, reassessing how likely those risks are,
Right.
how big their impact could be.
All right.
And you're adjusting those risk management strategies as things change, both inside and outside the organization.
So dynamic.
Yes,
Paced, E, I think I'm getting it.
there you go.
All right, so we've got a good idea of the principles. Let's move on to how an organization actually does risk management on a daily basis.
Yeah, let's talk process.
The risk management process,
Let's
right?
sit.
And no surprise here, I guess different frameworks describe this process a little differently.
It's kind of interesting, though, because even though there are variations, the number of steps, the terms they use, the underlying logic, the flow of it, it's pretty similar across the board.
Okay.
So you've got ISO 31000. That one usually lists 8 steps.
Right.
Starts with defining the scope, the context, the criteria, then moves on to risk assessment, which includes identifying, analyzing, and evaluating those risks.
Mm-hmm.
Then you've got risk treatment, monitoring and review, communication, and finally, recording and reporting.
Okay, and is that really the order that most organizations would do it in?
You know, the author actually points out that lots of organizations start by defining the context,
Okay.
even if that's not always the first step listed in the official framework.
So it makes sense to start with the context.
Yeah, I mean, you need to know the lay of the land before you can even start figuring out what could go wrong.
Makes sense.
Oh.
Okay, so that's ISO. What about CCAS?
So CSO, that one has its own well-established approach.
Right.
Back in 2004, they laid out 8 key steps. Things like establishing the internal environment, setting objectives, identifying potential events, assessing risks, and putting those control activities in place.
All right.
Now, their more recent update, the 2017 one, that integrates the process more closely within their 5 overarching components.
Right.
And the performance component in that one.
Yeah.
That specifically talks about identifying, assessing the severity, prioritizing and responding to risks, as well as building that portfolio view of risk.
Okay.
And it's actually really interesting to see how those COSO steps assess and prioritize line up directly with the analysis and evaluation stages in ISO 31000.
Oh, okay. So there's some overlap there.
Yeah, there's definitely some common ground there.
Cool. Okay, so we've got ISO and COSISO. What about the Orange Book?
So the Orange Book, while it's structured around 5 principles, it dedicates Principle D to risk management processes.
Okay.
And that includes identifying, assessing, treating, monitoring, and reporting on those risks.
Yeah.
And again, you can see a clear parallel with the structure laid out in ISO 31000.
So even though there are all these different frameworks and all these different terms,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of consistency in what they're actually talking about.
Yeah, the core ideas are very similar.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
So can we break this down into any kind of like simple steps? I feel like I'm still getting a bit lost.
Absolutely. So the author boils all this down to 4 core steps that you see again and again in most of these models.
Okay, I like simple.
Right. So the first one is define context and objectives.
Okay.
This is all about understanding both the internal and external environments that the organization's operating in,
Right.
and then being really clear about what they're trying to achieve.
Their goals. Okay.
Exactly. Without a good grasp of what's going on inside and outside the organization.
Yeah.
And without being crystal clear on those strategic goals, it's practically impossible to identify and assess the right risks.
Because you don't know what you're trying to protect. Okay, so define context and objectives. What's next?
All right, step 2 is assess the risks. This is where you get down to brass tacks.
Okay.
You're figuring out what could go wrong,
Right?
analyzing how bad it would be if it did,
Right.
and how likely it is to happen in the first place.
Okay.
And then you're deciding, is this level of risk okay?
Oh, okay.
Or do we need to do something to reduce it?
Okay, so that's where the analysis comes in.
Exactly. This is where the teams really get to work, brainstorming potential risks, using different methods to understand how badly they could impact the organization, how likely they are to occur,
Yeah.
and then making those informed decisions about which risks are the big ones,
Okay.
the ones that need the most attention and resources.
Got it. Got it. All right, step 3.
Step 3 is manage the risks. So now that you've figured out what the risks are and how bad they could be,
Yeah.
this is where you actually put things in place to address the ones that are unacceptable.
Okay.
This could mean trying to reduce the likelihood of the risk happening,
Okay.
minimizing the impact if it does happen,
Okay.
transferring the risk to someone else, like through insurance,
Right.
or even deciding to avoid that activity altogether.
So you've got options.
Absolutely. It's not just about identifying problems. It's
Yeah.
about taking action to address those problems.
Okay.
This stage is all about developing and implementing specific strategies and putting those controls and processes in place to make sure those strategies work.
Okay. And what about step 4?
Step 4, the final step. Monitor, review, and report.
Okay.
And this one really highlights that risk management isn't a one and done thing.
Right. You can't just check it off the list.
Nope. It needs constant attention.
Uh-oh.
You're always watching those risks,
Mhm.
checking if the controls are working,
Okay.
and regularly reporting on what's going on with the overall risk picture.
Okay.
The author talks about this idea of closing the loop,
Go ahead.
regularly asking, are we still on track to achieve our goals,
Right.
given the risks we're facing?
Okay.
And our ability to manage them.
So it's about feedback and adjustment.
Yeah, that feedback loop is super important for making sure risk management stays relevant and effective.
Okay.
Because things change all the time.
Right.
New risks pop up, the organization's resources and capabilities change.
Okay.
So you need that constant monitoring, reviewing, and adapting to stay ahead of the game.
Got it. So now we know why risk management is important and we have a good idea of the general steps involved.
Mm-hmm.
But let's talk about the nitty-gritty.
Yeah.
How does an organization actually set up their risk management efforts?
So that brings us to risk architecture.
Okay.
The author actually gives us another acronym here, RASP.
Okay. More acronyms. I love it.
Right. So RASP stands for Risk Strategy, Risk Architecture, and Risk Protocols.
Got it.
We'll get to strategy and protocols later.
Okay.
But for now, let's focus on that architecture.
Okay.
Think of it like the blueprint for how risk management works within the organization. So like the organizational chart for risk management.
Exactly. It lays out all the key elements, like who's in charge of making decisions about risk?
Mm-hmm.
What are the roles and responsibilities of different people and teams?
Okay.
How does information about risk flow up and down the organization?
Okay.
How do we make sure risk management is actually working?
Right.
And what kind of budget do we have for all this?
Budget, of course.
Yeah.
So the author even brings up this idea of, what was it? Agency theory.
Yeah, agency theory, it's a bit theoretical,
Okay.
but basically it's looking at the relationship between, say, Shareholders,
Okay.
they're the principal,
Got it.
and executives, they're the agent.
Right.
And the idea is that the shareholders are giving the executives the power to make decisions.
Right.
Now, when it comes to risk management, agency theory helps us understand how those different interests, because
Okay.
they might have different interests,
Right.
can influence how risk is seen and handled in the organization.
Okay, so how does that play out in practice?
Well, you might see some organizations where everything's very centralized.
Okay.
So you have a dedicated risk team at the top.
Right.
They set the strategy, the policies,
Got it.
and everyone follows their lead. Then you've got other organizations that are more decentralized,
Okay.
where each business unit has more freedom to manage their own risks.
Okay, so more autonomy.
Exactly. They own their own risk. And of course, a lot of organizations end up with some kind of hybrid approach.
Yeah, a mix of both.
Exactly. A bit of both.
Makes sense. So what are some of the key takeaways when it comes to setting up that risk architecture?
Well, the author is really clear about the importance of clearly defined roles and responsibilities.
Okay.
He says, just hiring a bunch of risk managers doesn't automatically mean you've got good risk management.
Yeah, you can't just outsource it.
Exactly. In fact, it can even make things worse if everyone else thinks, oh, the risk team's got this, I don't need to worry about it.
Yeah, like it's someone else's problem.
Exactly. Good risk management is everyone's responsibility.
Right.
Everyone needs to know what their role is,
Okay.
what they're accountable for.
So how do you actually make that happen? How do you define those roles?
Well, the author actually gives this really long list of roles that often have big risk management responsibilities.
Go.
Head of legal, business continuity manager, head of internal audit, compliance officer, you name it.
Wow, so it really is across the entire organization.
It really is.
It's not just one department.
Nope, it's everyone's job. And he even mentions these things called RACI charts.
RISI charts?
Yeah, they're often used in project management to figure out who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed for different tasks.
Okay, I can see how that would be helpful.
Right, and you can definitely apply that to risk management too.
Okay, so let's say an organization decides they need to get serious about ERM. What are some of the first steps they take?
Well, one of the very first things they often do is bring in some expert help, either by hiring a dedicated risk manager or by setting up a whole risk management team.
Right, bring in the specialists.
Exactly. And in some industries like banking or finance, having a chief risk officer is becoming a legal requirement.
Wow, so it's getting that serious.
Yeah, it's becoming a really big deal.
Yeah.
And of course, the author reminds us about those PACE-ERM principles.
Right, pace UB.
Yeah, he emphasizes how important they are for actually implementing ERM successfully.
Okay.
He also brings up a couple of interesting models that organizations can use to think about and even measure the benefits of ERM.
Okay, so what are those?
One is FIRM, which looks at the positive impact on financial, infrastructural, reputational, and marketplace aspects.
Okay, so it's a way of quantifying the value of ERM.
Exactly. And the other one is MADE2, which is another framework for evaluating how effective ERM is.
Okay, so basically, if an organization has a good ERM framework in place, that's a good sign of their overall risk management maturity.
Absolutely. It shows they're taking it seriously.
Yeah, they're not just winging it.
No, they've got a plan. And the author talks about 4 key steps for successful risk management:
Okay, lay it on me.
planning, implementing, measuring, and learning.
PML.
PML, exactly.
Okay, that's a good one.
Right. It's a nice, simple way to remember it.
It is.
And it really echoes that classic plan, do, check, act cycle that you see in so many management systems.
So it's all about continuous improvement.
Exactly. Always getting better.
Yeah.
But setting up a full ERM program,
Yeah.
that's a big task.
Okay.
It touches the whole organization.
Right.
And how long it takes to implement, that really depends on a lot of things.
Okay, so what kind of things are we talking about?
Well, the author mentions the organization's starting point.
Okay.
So what kind of risk management practices do they already have in place?
Right, right.
How committed is the senior leadership?
Yeah, do they really buy into it?
Exactly. The size and complexity of the organization.
Okay.
Do they operate internationally? And how many resources are they willing to put into it?
So a lot of factors. So what's a realistic time frame then?
Well, for those really big, complex global organizations,
Yeah.
we could be talking 3 to 5 years.
Wow, that's a big commitment.
It is. It's a long-term investment. And even just setting up the basics, like having a formal risk board
Right.
or a clear risk appetite statement, that can easily take a year or 2 for most organizations.
Right.
So it's not a quick fix.
So it's a journey.
Exactly. And some of the key things that can influence that timeline are the governance structures, how well defined their risk appetite is, how complex their risk profile is, the culture of the organization, how open they are to change, and, like we said, whether they operate globally or not.
Got it. So you're not just flipping a switch.
Nope. It takes time and effort.
Okay, so now let's talk about how all this risk information gets shared.
Yeah, the reporting.
Yeah, risk management reporting. Once you're actually identifying and assessing and managing these risks, how does that information get used to make decisions?
The author really stresses the importance of making risk a regular part of the conversation. So not just treating it as a separate thing, but weaving it into existing meetings. So team meetings, management reviews, and of course at the board level.
Got it.
He gives a good example of how that information might flow.
Okay, I like examples.
So you start with those regular team meetings. They discuss the risks that are relevant to their work. Then the key risks, the big concerns, those get escalated to senior management in their meeting. And finally, the most significant risks and the overall risk landscape, those get reported to the board.
So it goes all the way to the top.
Exactly. But here's the crucial part. The author points out that feedback needs to flow in the other direction too. From the board down to senior management and then down to the operational teams.
So it's a two-way street.
Exactly. Everyone needs to understand what decisions have been made, what the priorities are.
So there's alignment.
Yeah, that two-way communication is essential for making sure risk management is truly embedded and working properly.
Makes sense. Okay, so earlier we talked about RASP. We covered risk architecture and the planning that goes into it. Now let's talk about risk strategy. So when we talk about an organization's risk strategy, what are we actually talking about?
So it's basically their master plan for how they're going to deal with risk. It's how they plan to achieve their goals while managing those risks. It's the leadership's philosophy and approach to understanding, evaluating, and addressing risk.
So it's their overall game plan.
Exactly. It sets the tone from the top. It makes it clear whether risk management is just a box to check. Or if it's a core part of how they do business.
Got it. So what are the ingredients of a good risk strategy?
Well, the author says a comprehensive strategy usually has a few key components. Things like their risk management philosophy, how they actually integrate risk management into their daily activities, their risk appetite, how much risk they're willing to take on, the benchmarks they use to decide what's a significant risk, specific policies that guide decision-making, the methods they use to assess risks, and finally, their priorities when it comes to managing different types and levels of risk.
So it's a pretty comprehensive document.
It is. It covers a lot of ground.
All right, so you've got the strategy, and then that often gets formalized into a risk management policy.
Exactly. That's the formal, board-approved document that spells out the organization's approach to risk management. It's the guiding document for everyone.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. Now, the author does mention that in more decentralized organizations. You might see a central policy with some more specific ones at the business unit level.
So they can tailor it a bit.
To address their specific risks. But generally, these policies are kept pretty concise. Often less than 2 pages.
Wow, that's short.
They usually cover the core approach to risk, who's responsible for what, and how resources will be allocated.
So it's the high-level overview.
Exactly. Now, you can find examples online. But the author stresses that every organization needs to tailor their policy to their own specific situation.
Because what works for one company might not work for another.
Exactly. And the board's ownership of this policy is really important. It shows everyone that they're serious about risk management.
That it's a priority. Now we need to talk about risk appetite.
Yes, risk appetite.
We hear that term a lot in the business world.
That's a big one.
So how's it defined?
That's where things get really interesting and sometimes, well, risky.
Definitely.
So let's start with the fundamentals here. Risk appetite.
Risk appetite.
What is it really?
Risk appetite. Imagine it as, that line in the sand that your organization is willing to walk right up to, maybe even tiptoe over a bit to grab that brass ring. But if you cross it without realizing, it's like walking a tightrope blindfolded.
Makes sense.
The ERM, the Institute of Risk Management, they have a great definition. They say it's the amount of risk an organization is willing to take to reach those long-term goals.
That's good.
It's like the company's comfort zone with risk.
Yeah.
It dictates whether they're going to tackle a problem head on or just accept it and keep an eye on things.
So it's more nuanced than just spotting a potential issue, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's about that company-wide agreement on which risks are worth taking and which ones are absolute no-goes.
Yeah, totally.
And you mentioned how important it is for staff to understand this.
Oh, yeah.
Why is that consistency so crucial?
Well, you don't want your risk management to be a total free-for-all, right?
Right.
If everyone's unclear about the company's risk appetite,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have people doing their own thing.
Okay.
One person might be super cautious, trying to eliminate every tiny risk, while someone else is totally relaxed. And that could lead to, well, unexpected dangers for the entire organization.
And that's just based on their own personal views, not the company's agreed upon stance.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it really prevents chaos.
It does. It does.
You brought up a few terms related to risk appetite.
Oh,
Could you break those down a bit?
sure. So you've got the risk appetite itself. That's the baseline, like cruising speed.
Okay.
Then you've got risk tolerance. That's the level of risk the organization can handle for a bit, maybe while they're working to bring it down.
Like hitting some turbulence, but we can handle it.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's risk capacity. That's the absolute limit, the point of no return.
Like the wings falling off.
Yeah, like the wings falling off. You got it.
And this appetite isn't one size fits all, is it?
Definitely not.
Different companies, different appetites.
Absolutely. You'll see companies that are all about innovation and rapid growth.
Okay.
They're often more risk aggressive, willing to take bigger gambles for bigger rewards.
Right.
But then you've got companies in highly regulated sectors.
Mm-hmm.
They're usually much more risk averse.
Makes sense. Playing it safe.
Yeah, prioritizing avoiding risks altogether.
What's interesting is even within the same company,
Right.
you could have different departments with different appetites.
Absolutely. The R&D team, they're probably cool with more experimental risks, things the finance department would never touch.
That's true. That's true. It makes sense.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure everyone's on the same page when it comes to risk, even if different teams see it differently?
Right.
That's where that ERM, the enterprise risk management, comes in, right?
Exactly. ERM is essential for setting that overarching risk appetite and making sure it's applied consistently throughout the organization.
All right.
So when decisions are made about handling risk,
Mm-hmm.
everyone's working from the same understanding, the same playbook, no matter where the risk pops up.
And this isn't just an internal thing, right?
Yep.
The outside world plays a role in shaping a company's risk tolerance, too.
Absolutely. Risk appetite isn't decided in a vacuum.
Right.
It has to be aligned with the company's overall strategy, where they're trying to go, their day-to-day operations, and of course, all the laws and regulations they got to follow.
Right. Got to stay legal.
Always, always.
You mentioned that sometimes leadership can get so focused on the big goals, the wins, that they might overlook the potential downsides.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
Yeah.
Boards and senior management, they're naturally driven to hit those objectives, grow the business.
Makes sense.
But sometimes they might not fully grasp the level of risk involved in chasing those ambitions,
Right.
or even more importantly, whether the organization can actually handle those risks if things go south.
Right. That disconnect could be a big problem.
Huge vulnerability.
Okay. So risk appetite sets the when to act on a risk.
Mm-hmm.
Now, let's talk about the how, the risk protocols.
Okay.
What exactly are we talking about here?
Think of risk protocols as the rule book, the practical guide that takes the risk strategy and turns it into concrete actions.
Right.
You're not going to find this all in one giant document, usually.
Okay.
It'll be spread out across risk management manuals, standards, procedures, the tools and templates everyone uses, even the specific techniques for assessing risk.
And the names for these documents, they can vary a lot from company to company, right?
Oh, yeah. One company's risk management framework could be another's governance manual.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
So if risk appetite sets the boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
these protocols are the instructions on how to operate within those boundaries
Precisely.
and what to do if we get close to crossing them.
You got it.
Perfect analogy.
It is a good one.
So what kind of info would you typically find in these risk protocols?
Okay, so first off, you'll find detailed methods for actually identifying risks.
Okay.
the processes and techniques employees should be using.
Right.
Then you'll have very specific guidelines on the risk register, how it should be structured, what information needs to be recorded for each risk,
Right.
how it should be documented, how often it needs to be updated.
So everyone's on the same page.
Exactly.
Using the same format.
Absolutely. And crucially, the protocols will lay out the rules for logging risk events when they happen.
Okay.
And the criteria for deciding which events are serious enough to warrant further investigation and reporting.
Like a chain of command for escalating potential problems.
Yeah, you need that clear path.
What else?
Reporting requirements, those are super important.
Right.
This outlines how often risk reports need to be generated, the format, maybe weekly or monthly summaries.
Right.
It also details the methods for conducting risk analysis and how key risk indicators, the metrics that signal potential trouble, are tracked and reported.
With the warning signs.
Yeah, exactly. And you'd also typically find the approval processes for any spending needed to reduce those risks.
Makes sense.
And it often extends to contract management, too, outlining the steps for reviewing and approving new contracts from a risk perspective.
So it really is about making sure those risk management practices are consistent across the whole organization.
Absolutely. You don't want the strategy to just be a document on a shelf.
Right. It's got to be put into practice.
We need action every day.
And you mentioned the difference between a policy and a procedure.
Oh, yeah, that's
Can you
important.
clarify that?
Sure. A risk management policy is like the what and the why.
Okay.
It explains the organization's overall approach to risk and the reasoning behind it.
Right.
Procedures, on the other hand, they're all about the how.
The nitty-gritty.
Exactly. Whether it's called procedures, a framework, a manual, or just guidance, this detailed document ensures everyone's on the same page, following the same method.
Gotcha.
It defines the key terms, outlines roles and responsibilities, and often provides info on the specific tools and techniques to use.
And you said the risk management team usually owns this documentation.
Usually, yeah.
Why is that?
Well, mainly because it needs to be updated regularly.
Right.
The risks a company faces can change pretty quickly.
That's true.
So having the risk management team in charge means they can adjust the practices and guidance as needed
Okay.
without having to get board approval for every little tweak.
Nice things flexible.
Exactly. It keeps the protocols relevant and effective.
So we've talked about the when with risk appetite
Mm-hmm.
and the how with the risk protocols.
Right.
Now let's dive into the what with, the actual tools and techniques organizations use to manage risk.
All right, so as part of their risk management protocols, organizations typically provide information on the specific tools, which could be software, platforms, or even physical devices, and the techniques, which are the methods and approaches used for specific risk management tasks.
Can you give some examples?
Sure, a tool could be specialized modeling software for analyzing complex financial risks or project timelines.
Okay.
A technique could be something like a PESTLE analysis, which helps organizations systematically consider external factors like political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors to identify potential risks.
So a lot of different factors to
The
consider.
moving parts.
So the protocols might say, we need to assess market risks regularly, and then the technique section would guide employees to use a specific tool or method.
Exactly, like a competitive analysis framework or scenario planning.
Gotcha.
And while these specifics aren't usually written directly into the main procedure document,
Okay.
they're definitely referenced within it. These supporting documents might be fact sheets, toolboxes, step-by-step guides. They're there when someone needs to do a specific task.
Especially if it's a technique they're not familiar with.
Yeah, or one they only use occasionally.
Makes sense.
Things like root cause analysis, investigating the underlying causes of incidents, Monte Carlo simulations for forecasting potential outcomes for projects or investments,
Right.
or scenario analyses for exploring different possible future scenarios and their risks.
A lot of different methods.
Yeah, the key is to make this information easy to understand,
Right. User-friendly.
using flowcharts, step-by-step instructions, so people can do these tasks independently.
So it's like a supplementary guide providing the details for those specific risk-related tasks.
Exactly. They provide that extra layer of detail to ensure the protocols are applied consistently and effectively.
So we got the appetite, the protocols, the toolkit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how does a company actually keep track of all this information?
Right.
That's where the RMIS comes in, right?
Wow.
The Risk Management Information System.
Exactly. Think of the RMIS as the central nervous system for risk management,
Okay.
connecting the risk management team with every part of the organization.
Right.
In many cases, it starts with simple spreadsheets using standardized templates.
Okay.
But there's a definite trend towards more sophisticated IT systems, specifically for storing, analyzing, and reporting this info to senior management.
What's driving that shift?
It's about being able to effectively analyze risk data coming in from all over the company.
Right.
Instead of having vital information scattered across a bunch of spreadsheets, a centralized RMIS gives you a much more complete view of the organization's overall risk landscape.
Like a bigger picture.
Exactly. And for many organizations, the risk register is that central hub.
Okay.
It might start as a simple Excel spreadsheet.
But not a Word doc or PowerPoint.
Definitely not, but those basic tools have their limits, especially with large data sets and complex relationships between risks.
What are the benefits of a well-maintained risk register?
Even a basic one, if it's well managed, can offer huge benefits.
Okay. It consolidates knowledge about all the risks the organization faces and the controls in place to mitigate them.
Right.
It's customizable, so you can tailor it to your specific needs, and regular updates keep the information current, which leads to better decision-making.
Makes sense.
Ultimately, it helps prioritize risk management efforts and allocate resources effectively.
Now, you mentioned specialized RMIS software.
Yeah.
What do they offer that goes beyond a basic spreadsheet?
These platforms, some focused on specific areas like insurance claims or project risks, while others offer a company-wide solution, provide huge advantages in terms of data consistency, standardized formats, and powerful analytical capabilities.
Right.
This leads to fewer errors and gaps in the data compared to juggling multiple spreadsheets.
Right.
We're also seeing more adoption of the GRC approach, which stands for governance, risk management, and compliance.
Okay.
This is often managed through integrated platforms.
Feel like everything's in one place. Exactly. Companies like MetricStream, for example, offer platforms that unify these three areas, making it much easier to manage interconnected risks, regulatory requirements, and compliance in a coordinated way.
And they call it a unified framework.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
It sounds like these advanced tools can really change the game when it comes to understanding risk.
They can, for sure.
You also mentioned predictive modeling.
Oh yeah, some of the more advanced tools can leverage the data for predictive modeling.
Okay.
For example, using Monte Carlo simulations to analyze potential costs and schedule overruns in projects.
So you can anticipate problems before they happen.
Exactly, but it's important to remember that an RMIS is a tool.
Right.
It doesn't replace human expertise and judgment.
Gotcha.
It's a powerful enabler, but not a substitute for strategic thinking.
It helps inform those decisions, but doesn't make them for you.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about the frameworks that guide how organizations approach risk management. The ERM frameworks.
All right, so ERM is built on principles from globally recognized frameworks.
Okay.
The key ones are ISO 31000, an international standard for risk management, COSO from the Committee of Sponsoring Organizations of the Treadway Commission, widely used in the US, and the UK's Orange Book, specifically for the public sector.
So different frameworks or different contexts.
Yeah, but the central focus of ERM is integrating risk management into everything an organization does.
Right, making it part of the DNA.
Exactly, and ensuring it's aligned with their objectives and decision-making.
So it's not just a checklist, it's baked into every choice.
Precisely.
What are some key principles from each framework?
Okay, from ISO 31000, the big one is integration.
Right.
Risk management shouldn't be a separate function, but an integral part of everything.
Embedded in the culture.
Yes. And ISO 31000 also stresses the need for a structured and systematic approach.
Okay.
Tailored to the organization, inclusive of everyone involved, dynamic and adaptable, and responsive to new risks.
Makes sense. A flexible approach.
And then there's ISO 3110. That's the international guide for identifying, analyzing, and evaluating risks.
So, the nuts and bolts of risk assessment.
Exactly. You don't need to memorize the number, just know it's a go-to resource.
Got it. Now, what about COSO? What does that bring to the table?
COSO emphasizes the importance of governance and culture in creating a risk-aware environment.
Okay.
It highlights the connection between managing risk and achieving strategic goals.
So, linking risk to performance.
Yeah, and it puts a big focus on accountability at every level.
Right. Everyone's responsible.
Yeah, exactly. COSO is all about understanding how risk impacts value creation, integrating risk into strategy setting, and ultimately driving better decisions and performance.
So, the company's values and leadership play a huge role in how seriously they take risk management.
Absolutely.
And lastly, the Orange Book. What does that emphasize?
The Orange Book reinforces the need for transparency in risk management processes.
Right.
The importance of proportionality, making sure controls match the level of risk.
Right, no overkill.
And a commitment to continuous improvement.
Always getting better.
It also formally introduces the concept of risk appetite,
Okay.
emphasizing how important it is for an organization to be clear about how much risk they're willing to accept.
So when you look at all these frameworks together, what's the big picture?
They advocate for a proactive, continuous, and people-centered approach to risk management.
Right.
Effective risk management isn't a one-time task, but an ongoing process that makes the organization more resilient, improves governance, ensures alignment between goals and operations, and ultimately contributes to sustainable performance.
So it's about making risk a conscious part of every decision, not just a separate item on a to-do list.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So for our listeners, we've really dug into the core elements of how organizations handle risk.
Yeah, we have.
We've explored risk appetite, risk protocols, and the information systems that keep everything organized.
And the key takeaway is that a well-defined risk management approach provides that essential framework for decision-making. It helps everyone move beyond their own personal interpretations of risk and work together.
Now, here's a final thought for you to consider. How can these principles of organizational risk management apply to your own life or work?
Interesting question.
Even if you don't have formal protocols or fancy software, think about it. What's your personal risk appetite in different areas of your life?
Yeah,
And what kind of informal protocols do you already have in place?
makes you think.
It's fascinating to see how these big picture concepts can be relevant on a personal level.
It is.
If you're interested in going deeper, check out those ERM frameworks we mentioned,
Yeah, good idea.
or look into how different industries approach risk management.
Definitely worth exploring.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.